This is a really cool parcel that I had the pleasure of designing last week. I was on a client trip in Ohio for 7 clients in 8 days. That's pretty normal. I used to be in Ohio 3 times a year, 10 clients each trip, but I keep pushing that back. And so I'd rather stay home. I love going to clients. I can't imagine never not going to clients and designing parcels because that's where you learn. We have a real luxury of when we go to a client parcel of learning something on every parcel, reinforcing something on every parcel. And to me, it's critical. There's people that go to 10, 15, 20 parcels a year. And I've averaged 100, or near 100 for the last 21 seasons. And so you learn something on every parcel, and I love to teach and bring it back to you guys. And this was a really cool one because when I looked at it, it illustrated some really great points of concepts that I originated and teach on client parcels and how to look at them. This is a 100-acre parcel, and that fits our average. I'd say that half of our parcels are 50 to 60 acres or less every single year. But then we work with parcels that are hundreds of acres, sometimes over 1,000. That brings the average up. So you can say the average parcel size is about 100 acres, but really the average parcel is much smaller. I hope that makes sense. So we work on a lot of parcels down to 5 acres, 8 acres. Dylan, what's the smallest you've done?
Smallest I did was 8 last year. Yep.
So it's interesting because that's one of the smallest I've been to too. So it seems to be a common theme. A lot of times 10 acres, they take out a couple acres for a house. You're left with 8 acres. And I went to one of those like that last year too. This parcel illustrates some really cool concepts. And I'm going to talk about this parcel. I'll try to break it down, show you the drawing. These drawings don't make sense to a lot of people. They'll make sense to the client. The colors might be familiar from one to the other. Trying to make it look as pretty as possible, but I'm not an artist. So what's really important, I'll just mention very fast before they dive into this. When we go to a parcel, there's never going to be a more clear time to draw this parcel out than the day of the visit. When we would send a parcel, and I haven't done this for a very long time. In fact, I've almost never done this unless the client had a wish or desire or an emergency. But I don't like sending a parcel drawing 2 weeks later. I've heard of habitat consultants sending a parcel 6 months later. Again, it's never going to be more clear than the day of the visit. So if I'm waiting a week, remember during that week, I might have had 7 more clients. I have a lot of other stuff going on too. I will remember that parcel. I remember that parcel, especially after I draw it. It's like refreshing the memory. It's like taking notes. I'll remember it for years to come. But when I haven't drawn it down, when I haven't drawn it out, and I have to draw it out 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, there's a lot missing. It's just not as clear. So we draw it out the same day of the visit. That's critical. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes on average. Dylan, what does it take you?
I usually tell people 30 to 45 minutes, and then it ends up taking me 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I always think I can draw it out faster than I can.
So I tell people an hour and 15 minutes, and sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's an hour and a half. So, yeah, But pretty similar. But the bottom line is it's so critical to draw that out. We take the time to draw it, and then we almost insist, like I make people, sometimes 2 people, record it on their phone. I don't care if they want to video it. They can take notes all they want, but that recording is small. It's only 45 megabytes for an hour. So they can email it, they can keep it, or if you take an hour video on your phone, it could be 30 gigabytes. So a huge difference. It takes up tons of memory and space. And so that's our process. And when we go over that, I've had an hour and 15-minute conversation turn into 26 pages of typed notes. Tons of question, discussion. It's very, very complete. So when we leave at the day of the visit, not only was it the most clear, we've gone over everything, but when we leave, that client could start to work that very next day with a plan, not waiting weeks and especially months, which is ridiculous. And if you wait that long, it's not any clearer to you or I. So we draw this out the same day, and that is critical for any competent deer hunting manager. Because again, when you wait 3 weeks, you're almost making stuff up just to fill a piece of paper. So this design right here, and a common theme, where you see that burgundy red color on the map, that used to be all food plot. Where you see small food plots, the green down off to the sides, that used to be part of big food plot. The point is that these middle food plots, this is an upper shelf. In fact, my client called it a tabletop. Each one of those 4 big food plots down the center of this drawing, heading north to south or south to north, are all approximately 3 to 4 acres in size. Pretty good size. One might even be closer to 5. But the point is, they were using that tabletop in the entire, because off that tabletop, it's terrace. So imagine a steep drop off all the way around that upper tabletop that drops down 20 to 30 feet or 20 to 30 yards, approximately 30 feet in elevation, 20 feet in elevation, depending on where you're at. And so there's a lot of wasted space. So by the time you take out 14, 15 acres of food plots up there, you take out the side coverage, you're taking 100 acres, and you're taking out from north to south at least 20 to 25 acres just for access. And what they're running into is the sides of that tabletop. Now deer are sometimes bedding there as they're trying to get to the food plots down below. It's time to start checking out seed and food plot seed, wildlife blend seed right now. We have it available all year at purewildlifeblends.com, but we call it Pure Wildlife Blends for a reason. We use no junk, no fillers, no bad seed combination. I infuse 25 years of food plot and wildlife blends research into each and every product personally, what I've written about, web classes, hundreds of articles and videos. It's all here to help you out. But again, check out purewildlifeblends.com. It's a great time to do so. So a recurring theme with this is pulling the food up towards the tabletop. And so instead of the major food being down here, putting that up on top right here. That allows you a huge advantage in a situation like this, because when that is crowned and you're on a ridge top, then for daylight access, you can access right through the food and drop down to hunt small hunting plots off the side, water holes. And then because all the major food is up on top and hidden, it's like a shelf up there, then it's easy for you to get around down below where you have lots of switchgrass, smaller hunting plots, because all the deer are trying to get to those big plots that are the most diverse up top. So you're creating more depth. When you have food down the bottom, previously all that red on this right side up here on the east side, that was all food. That puts a huge amount of deer right here on the neighbors. Now the neighbors happen to be non-hunting neighbors on that side. A lot of regen, a lot of growth, good to hold deer. But the problem is those deer would hold up on that property, at least the mature bucks, and then right at dark they're moving over. So by the time they got to a major food source just 100 yards away, a lot of times it's at dark. And those deer then are on 95% of the daylight on the neighbors, which you can't hunt. So never a good thing, even if it's public land or unpressured, unhunted land adjacent. So by moving the food up here, now you create depth going this way. And these little hunting plots that are in clover, where they're a quarter acre or less, 1/8 of an acre, not only can be accessed easily, the deer are just passing through to get to the big plot up above. So it makes a nice pass-through hunting plot now instead of a dead-end destination that you can't sit on without spooking deer. Now you have that little hunting plot where they're just passing through, and those little hunting plots don't push back into the cover very far to keep mature bucks from bedding close. So a very big food plot that's 3 or 4 acres will have a greater impact depending on your area, how far those mature bucks will bed away from it. Does and fawns will bed close to the food, young bucks, and then older bucks. So by shifting that food over about 100 yards on average, now you just created 100 yards more depth going over towards the border. You also, so now you have better access because you can access during daylight through the big food on top. No deer can see you coming through. So you're coming out in the morning, it's 11 o'clock. Go right through the middle of the food. You're going in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Go right through the middle of the food. That's one of the things we teach people. Then when you come out, then you're going back around here and getting out, going out the driveway and come around. So you're not going through that big food on your way out. So it's giving you more access. So you get better access. Screening is supplied by all that switchgrass. And if you look at all the yellow that's there on that switchgrass, all that switchgrass is now acting as a buffer. The deer don't like to bed within solid switchgrass. Now they do if that's the only cover available. There's always exceptions to this rule, but where you have a lot of cover, if deer are bedding in switchgrass, it's a bad thing because there's no food in switchgrass. They literally have to leave twice during their bedding hours to go find some browse. Deer want to feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. They're rhythmic pattern feeders. If they're bedding in switchgrass during the daylight or conifer, it's because there's a lack of quality habitat in the area. So that always needs to be addressed. So in this case, when you have all of that switchgrass, you have a bunch of switch along the driveway, you have a lot of switch in here. Now you have better deer habitat as a whole through there. Now it's easy for you to get out through switchgrass, go around, go up through switchgrass in between food plots because deer aren't feeding there, they're not bedding there. So it gives you a lot better access. Because of this food, as we'll go throughout here, and I'll just put this, you know, there's four blocks of big food all together. Because you have good habitat going on either side of these, and you're creating a linear long food source, then the deer don't bed overall, they get to spread out. So you have does and fawns bedded close to that food all the way up and down. The tighter you get those does and fawns, let's say you took that same amount of food plot space, now does and fawns have to bed on top of each other going back into the cover. But when you have long linear food sources, you know, no different than if you had a long skinny food plot, now deer, does and fawns can bed by themselves without running into each other along that entire length. That means bucks can bed behind them in a lot closer fashion to that food source. Now, if you have one big food source like this, and your cover layers out into here, now these deer have to bed on top of each other. So the same amount of deer right here have to bed on top of each other. That means you limit the amount of deer that can bed in that area because they're all on top of each other. It's very stressful. You stick them all right here, and that pushes bucks a lot further away to that stress and commotion. And because all those deer are on top of each other and they don't have their own space, then you can fit fewer mature bucks, does and fawns in the given movement. So a situation like this where you have food all the way through from north to south allows does and fawns to bed closer, and then you can have bucks bedding then on the property even by just moving it 100 yards overall. So that's a very, very good thing. Then you have hunting pressure that you always have to deal with. So part of the interview process is we find out where the most hunting pressure is around the property, who has food sources around the property, because the neighbor's food sources will affect this depth too. Let's look at it this way. Let's say a big neighborly food source is right here. Well, then maybe you shouldn't even have a food source up here. We'd look at it differently because then you'd need this depth going back to the neighbor's food source to actually hold deer. So you have to consider what's going on in the neighbors too in that depth, because every place you have a large food plot, whether it's on your neighbors or yourself, will push deer further away from that food source. The number one way to ruin a big buck bedding area is to put food source right in the middle of that bedding area. Now, he felt comfortable because he was 300 yards away from the biggest food source or nearest food source. Now you stick food there. Now he's got to move another 300 yards. Or if it's a small hunting plot, maybe he's got to move 100 yards. Maybe when he moves 100 yards, he doesn't have any bedding cover, so then he's gone out of the area. That's why we want each one of these food sources in the same diversity and blend, because we don't want does favoring one end or the other. We want them evenly distributed throughout here in a nice, calm, low stress atmosphere so that each one of these can potentially have a line of movement of bucks that goes in and out of each food plot. Now you notice some areas, and I'll highlight these, let's say in red. I have an area right here in the middle where you don't see it shaded in brown. I have an area up here and down through here. This is not shaded in brown either. And then I have an area down here on the bottom. These are all areas that I don't want timber cutting. The reason is because there's hunting pressure down here on the neighbor's parcel right here. So we want this to be all open timber, this to be improved timber and cover, so that the deer are encouraged to go back and forth this way and not off the property to the south to the hunting pressure. You can never say never, but where you make improvements, where you align your food, that'll keep deer moving in a predictable pattern as opposed to be going through open timber without cover to a neighboring parcel and getting shot. This area right here, this is for access. So they can get up to here and they can leave from here to get around. So I don't want to improve areas of access, and that includes this area right here along this ridge system, because they can have a great water hole stand right here. They can access in this corner. That's a legal easement. And then they can have stand locations up here too. So they can get to stand locations and get on the edge of improved cover without having to go through that improved cover. So as a timber stand improvement, you would be improving in these areas not in red around the property, because that fits within the plan. And that's why you can't just have a timber stand improvement or a forester come out and say, this is what we're gonna do with the timber. It has to be aligned with how you can hunt the property. Again, all those burnt red areas, those are all improving into deer holding cover and diversity. In that case, taking those old food plots that were big, we're adding switchgrass around those areas, switchgrass pockets in between, fenced off plantings, big rock trees, shrubs, trees that we do out here, or just letting it go to early successional growth. But the switchgrass provides enough cover, sometimes within a year, but especially within 2 growing summers, to where that switchgrass is 6-7 feet tall. And now the deer actually feel like they have a place that they can call home right up next to those big food plots. So I want those does and fawns bedding in those red areas. And the more we can stack them in a linear fashion against that tabletop food source from north to south, then we can establish buck bedding down in those brown areas on either side adjacent to that, especially when they're different levels. So you have the tabletop up high, it steps down to those burnt red bedding areas, and then it steps down even more to those improved hardwood timber management areas down below. So it creates an entire system where in the end, you're taking into account your neighborly hunting pressure. You're taking into account how you can access. And once you access and you actually create depth because of where you push that food to, now you create small little hunting pass-through plots in between. They can be hunted sometimes for morning, but especially afternoon. Then you create defined morning stands that are back in further and on your points and away from those big food plots, so that you have defined morning, defined afternoon stands. We can even go through here and I'll look at these numbers right here of stand locations. Number 1, 2, 3, because you can access into 4, 5, 6, 7, because you can access into 8 away from big food, even number 10, those all become morning stand opportunities. Then you have the rest that are either in between or afternoon stands. What's great about that is now, what I tell clients all the time, people say, well, we got to have southeast winds. We got to have southwest wind stands because those are your predominant winds almost everywhere in the north half of the country. No, they are not northwest. That means every day is getting colder. Northwest winds are your short winds. They blow out hard. That's when the big cold fronts come through. Easterly winds are in front side of every front that comes through, northeast, southeast. Westerly winds blow out the front. If it's a warm front, it's going to be south-southwest, usually south-southeast. If it's a cold front, it could be north-northwest, west-northwest. So if you look at all those winds, something southerly is your predominant wind. But regardless, so these people knew that. These clients, they said, we need more south-southwest, southwest stands. And I had many clients tell me that because people are starting to be educated more and pay attention, not just follow. We've got to have northwest during the hunting season. Encourage you to look at weather underground for your area, count it up. You can look at it by degrees. You know, how many, whatever degrees, 90 degrees, 180, 270, 360, you can look and count it up. And you can say, well, this is how many winds we have of that, whether it's east, north, south, west, whatever it might be. You can count it up and you can look at the percentages for October, November. You'll find that northwest is one of your smaller ones. It's 20%, 15%, 25 at the most on a given month of October, November, December, in just about anywhere. So in this case, when you're looking at wind directions, you don't go into designing a property or your land saying we need this certain number of winds, stands. What you do is you design your property properly. You give it that flow of however you access and get out of your land into it, design it correctly with enough depth, And what you'll find is you have about an even number of stands for every wind direction going around the entire farm. It might be cheated a little bit towards one or the other. But bottom line, that meaning that you might have 4 stands for southeast, you might have 5 stands for northwest, you might have 5 for southwest. You go around the horn and you have a pretty even amount for all of them, not 8 for one, 3 for another. They're generally 5 or 6 or 4 or 3 to 4. You know, there's a close proximity to each other. And that gives you those defined AM and PM stands. They had 0 defined AM and PM stands because they're accessing for everything about in the same spots. These clients were actually on the upper end. They've shot some beautiful bucks, really, really nice bucks throughout the year. And I will say a couple of these guys are military trained. And they saw some pretty hard combat in tours. And for that, I see a lot of those guys, they come back and they're used to out in the desert not wanting to get shot. So when they come back and that clicks with, we're hunting deer like we would the Taliban out in the desert, it really clicks and they hunt pretty smart. And these guys were hunting pretty smart. But that layout and design of properties is what becomes really difficult. When you have all these openings that are ready to plant, it becomes even more difficult. And that's why they needed help. They didn't need help hunting smart. They needed help laying out the property in a smart fashion. They know how to hunt without getting shot back at if the deer had guns. And that's where we come in a lot of these areas. And I hope that makes sense. I feel like we're really able to help these clients going north to south. I can't wait for them to hunt because they have some true monsters in the area. And the problem when you don't have that depth and it's fragmented and you're putting a lot of deer on your neighbors, those deer have options. And so where you don't have constant attention of their daylight attention, then when they're sitting back in their bedding area on their neighbor somewhere, even if those neighbors aren't hunting, well, do they move north a quarter mile to the other neighbor? When they move south to the quarter mile, do they move the opposite direction? But when you have their captive attention into your habitat, they're centered on your hunting plots, going to your big food plots or your water holes, going to your water holes from their bedding area, headed towards big food, then you have them. And that's when you command their attention, and that's when you can really grow a herd. And we'll talk about in the future in another video, but this neighbor up here was an attention. They were there. They were a part of the tour because they want to work together. Working together means working apart. I want these people up here to do the same thing in reverse. I want their access to be along this line, and then they tip into their big hollow. And we talked about that. I tried to help the neighbor out as much as possible. Because then they start to develop a herd of their own up here. You only need to command the daylight attention of that 95% of the time they're in the daylight, which is only 5% of their overall movement in a given home area bucks. So I want these people to be separate, these people to be separate, because then these people have mature bucks and these have mature bucks separately on their land. No different than if it was a giant parcel and there's a road going right through the middle. You have 2 parcels, not like you're trying to force deer across the road because then they get hit. I want these people to share as few bucks as possible with these people, because then overall the neighborhood benefits. As opposed to putting everything together, then they're just sharing these bucks, they go back and forth, and that's a problem that we'll talk about in another video. The bottom line, I hope, we'll try to share these. We try to share a few going into the season, especially when we're out on them. I get excited when I see these because this will make huge changes for these people. And we changed what they planted. Each one of these big tabletops is going to be 25% brassica in this case, 25% of the fall power greens, 50% in corn. That works for them. In Ohio, they can actually brush hog half their corn down the end of October legally. They can brush down another 25% before December, another 25% before January. There's some strategy to that too, different than somewhere else. But bottom line is this will make huge changes. I can't wait to hear about it. And I hope you're able to take some of these changes and apply them to your own hunting land for this season.